What is up, guys? Guess who? It's me, Red Chaos One, the Pope of YouTube himself, descending or ascending from his basement after long suffering hours in order to bring you an amazing video on fantasy before Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. Because, hey, as impossible as it sounds, Tolkien didn't invent fantasy. Why are you booing? Why are you booing? Why are you people? Oh God! Please put the pitchforks down. Dear God, please don't kill me before you hear me out, guys. We good? Okay. So while Tolkien didn't invent fantasy, so many people recognize that he had such a huge influence on it. And I'm not trying to take away his achievements. So, yeah, that's why I'm talking about this. I don't want to take away Tolkien's achievements. He had a big influence on fantasy, but we're going to be talking about fantasy before Tolkien and some concepts which Tolkien didn't invent. So, yeah. Tolkien's influence is so big that we might as well divide fantasy into, like Jesus Christ himself cutting history between pre-Tolkien and after Tolkien. Now, before we continue, the usual, leave a like, subscribe, you can subscribe, and if you're not subscribed, please subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I would very much appreciate it, guys. Also, remember my story, Phantom Ddraig. It's an action high fantasy web novel with the links to it in the description below. So if you're interested, you can check that out. Now, yeah, let's get on to the rest of the video. Also, P.S. I'm talking about Western pre-Tolkien fantasy because fantasy is too broad. There's Eastern fantasy, and yeah, there's a lot of that. So I'm talking about pre-Tolkien Western fantasy. I'll mention some Eastern stuff here and there, but remember, mainly I am talking about pre-Tolkien Western fantasy. Now, since as far as we look into the past, men have always told stories with fantastical elements, from tales of mighty gods engaging in tales of cosmic grand importance like the Titanomachy, the Vedas, the battles of Mag Turid and Ragnarok, to tales of men engaging in inspirational feats like the tales of the Mahadramata War, the Iliad, the tales of Samson, Hercules, David, Beowulf, Saint George, King Arthur, the Feyfolk fairies, and just so many more legends. These ancient stories have their very DNA in the building blocks of fantasy. From when we put it on paper today, if one were to read the stories, you would find similar tropes and ideas, and even the greatest of fantasy stories, like how the Hobbit has inspiration from the theft of the dragon's gold in Beowulf. So remember, fantastical elements in storytelling have been with us since the very beginning. So while I will try to be chronological, please know that I might be all over the place during certain time periods. So right now, let's go to the Romance period of the Middle Ages. Such stories of the time were collectively known as romance stories, and you would have stories known as the Matters, such as the Matters of Britain, that involved the stories of King Arthur, like Le Morte d'Arthur, which was written by Sir Thomas Malory in the 1400s. Others include the Matters of France, which focused on the stories of Charlemagne and his paladins, and others were the Matters of Rome, that include characters like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. which is to be expected when you're talking about the matters of Rome, even though Alexander the Great was Greek, I mean. Yeah. Other fictional stories of the time include the likes of Valentin and Orson, which is the story of twin brothers abandoned in the woods in infancy. Sorry. Valentine is brought up as a knight at the court of Pepin, while Orson grows up in a bear's den to be a wild man of the woods, until he is overcome and tamed by Valentine, whose servant and comrade he becomes. In some versions, the pair discover the true history with the help of a magical brazen head. The two eventually rescue their mother, Belisant, sister of Pepin and wife of the Emperor of Greece, by whom she had been unjustly repudiated from the power of a giant named Ferragus. So yeah, from just this ancient story, you can see a lot of the stuff that you see in modern fantasy stories. The hidden heirs, saving a trapped maiden from a monster that has imprisoned her. And other stories of this Romance period include one called The Fairy Queen, which are a series of 3 books first published in the year 1590, then republished in 1596 together with extra books 4 to 5. It is one of the longest poems in the English language. It is also the work in which Spenser, its author, invented the verse known as Spenserian stanza. So you know something new every day. On a literal level, the poem follows several knights as a means to examine different virtues. And though the text is primarily an allegorical work, it can be read on several levels of allegory, including as a praise or later a criticism of Queen Elizabeth I. Knightly romances involving knightly duels and combat against giants and sorcerers can be found in these works. It is probably the first work in which most of the characters aren't human but elves. There's also, hear this out, mention of wars between goblins and elves, something which has become a core part of fantasy. So elves versus goblins is something that goes way back. And also, another prominent writer of this time period who wrote fantasy was one William Shakespeare. Now hold up. Before you try to flame me alive, listen. Willie Boy wrote fantasy. And if you don't agree, then fight me, son, or daughter, or whatever you identify as. Now yeah, Shakespeare wrote stories with fantastical elements that count as fantasy. No matter how pissed it makes snobs of literature. These stories include A Midsummer Night's Dream, which debuted on January 1st, 1605, and is a play that is set in Athens and consists of several subplots that resolve around the marriage of Theseus and Hippolyta. One subplot involves a conflict between 4 Athenian lovers. Another follows a group of 6 amateur actors rehearsing the play which they are to perform before the wedding. Both groups find themselves in a forest inhabited by fairies who manipulate the humans and engage in their own domestic intrigue. So yeah, that was fantasy. And another one of Shakespeare's fantastical plays is Macbeth, which was premiered the following year in 1606 and continued with multiple fantastical elements like the witches and such. In 1605, the first part of Miguel de Cervantes' novel Don Quixote, or if you want, The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha, which was a satirical look at fantasy romances of the time, taking a mocking look at knights who had been, at this point, a prominent aspect of fantastical stories. The book, unfortunately, had a major influence. Oh, sorry, not unfortunately. Actually, the book had a major positive influence on the literature community, as evidenced by direct references in Alexander Dumas's The Three Musketeers. Unfortunately, from this book, we can also see that at the time, the romance genre of fantasy was beginning to die out, or it was beginning to lose that spark, you could say. With the period of enlightenment, literally fairy tales began to flourish after the romance had seen a decline. In fact, the term fairy tale was created by famed author of the period, Madame d'Aulnoy, who termed her works Contes de Fées, which translates to fairy tales, and is a term that we still use today. Another great figure of the time was Charles Perraut, who also laid the foundations of the new literary genre. The fairy tales, which with his work, which he derived from earlier folk tales, were published in his book Histoires ou Contes du Temps Passé. The best known of his tales include Little Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, and Puss in Boots. Many of Perraut's tales became fairy tale staples and have influenced the literary genre up till today. This era, while seeing a big influx in the tales that we love today, was unfortunately very hostile to fantasy, with prominent writers of the time such as Daniel Defoe and many others who were more interested in a realistic style of writing, being very critical of fantastical elements in fiction. Aside from a few tales of witchcraft and ghost stories, very little fantasy was being written at this time period. Even children's literature saw little fantasy. It aimed to edify and deplore fairy tales as lies because, literally snobs have been a thing since forever, unfortunately. On the bright side, this allowed the fantasy genre to begin to mix and form into its very own thing away from realistic fiction. Though I'm still confused as to how this thing wasn't easy to tell differently from back then. Anyway, in reaction to Enlightenment's cult of reason, Romanticism was what arose next. Romanticism highly prized the supernatural, tradition, and imagination together with the ages in which they were supposed to rule, the Middle Ages. These traits readily borrowed traditional elements of the fantastic. The Romantics invoked the medieval romances as justifications for the works they wanted to produce, in distinction from the realistic pressures of the Enlightenment. These were not always fantastic, sometimes being merely unlikely to happen, but the justification was used even from fantasy. Such prominent authors of this time include Johann Ludwig Tieck, who was born in the year 1773 on the 31st of May, and was a German poet, fiction writer, translator, and critic. He is one of the founding fathers of the Romantic movement in the late 18th and early 19th century. His collection, Fantasy, contained several short fairy tales, including one called The Elves. Another prominent author is E.T.A. Hoffmann, who wrote books such as The Golden Pot, published in 1814, and The Nutcracker and the Mouse King, published in 1816. In 1837, English author Stella Coleridge also wrote a fantasy novel called Phantasmion. She was the daughter of poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge and his wife Sarah Fricker. And the book is described as the first fairy tale novel written in English. Historian of literature Dennis Butts describes Phantasmion as a remarkable pioneer in fantasy and an extraordinary monument to her talent. The songs in Phantasmion were much admired at the time by Leigh Hunt and other critics. Some of them, such as Sylvan Stagg and One Face Alone, are extremely graceful and musical, and the whole fairy tale is noticeable for the beauty of the story and the richness of its language. Some historians of the fantasy genre believe that Phantasmion may have been the influence of George MacDonald, another great fantasy author who I will mention later, but just know that the man had a great influence on Tolkien and Lewis. Now, after Romanticism and enough people had pulled their heads out of their asses with the Enlightenment, we come to early fantasy. Early modern fantasy could be seen in the Victorian period with books like The Christmas Carol, written by Charles Dickens in 1845, others like John Ruskin's 1841 fantasy story, The King of the Golden River, a fairy tale of what happened to two men who tried to get rich in evil ways, and of how the fortune they sought came to their younger brother, whose kind and loving heart prompted him to the right action, and is widely considered a masterpiece of 19th century stories for children. The view of many is that modern fantasy truly began to take shape under authors like George MacDowell, who was born on 10th December 1824. MacDowell, as I have mentioned before, was a major influence on both J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. The Scottish author wrote such books as The Princess and the Goblin, which was published in 1872, whose plot being that a princess named Irene discovers a secret staircase leading to a wonderful revelation. At the same time, Cardi, another character, overhears a fiendish plot by goblins. Princess Irene and Cardi must make sense of their separate knowledge to foil the goblin scheme. This book is extremely influential, with J.R.R. Tolkien's depictions of goblins within Tolkien's Legendarium being heavily influenced by the goblins within The Princess and the Goblin. So, as you have seen, everything I have mentioned so far, you will find it in modern fantasy. So yeah, MacDonald influenced Tolkien's goblins. Another one of his fantasy stories is Fantasty. This one isn't a children's story, it's a much more adult story, which was published in 1858. This story concerns a young man who is pulled into a dreamlike world and where he hunts for his ideal of female beauty embodied by the Marble Lady. Adonis lives through many adventures and temptations while in this other world. So yeah, this was before people were making full-on fantasy worlds not beholden to our own. This was more the era of portal fiction. Where was I? Oh yeah. Until he is finally ready to give up his ideals. C.S. Lewis wrote concerning his first reading of Fantasy at age 16, this is a quote, that night my imagination was in a certain sense baptized. The rest of me, not unnaturally, took longer. I had not the faintest notion what I had let myself in for by buying Fantasties. So yeah, you can see how I said McDowell is a big guy. Now, another book of his is his 1895 novel Lilith. Now this is also another adult story, and it's a story which is more concerned with the nature of life, death, and salvation. Lilith is considered the darkest of MacDonald's works and among the most profound. In the story, McDowell mentions a cosmic sleep that heals tortured souls and precedes the salvation of all. So yeah, this is dark metaphysical fantasy stuff. McDonald's, I don't know why I keep calling him McDowell. It's McDonald. And yeah, that's the last book of his. I think from what I've been able to look up, this is the last book that he wrote. The following year, in 1896, British artist, poet, and author William Morris published one of the most influential books in fantasy as well, called The Well at the World's End. He was deeply inspired by the medieval romances and sagas. His style was deliberately archaic, based on medieval romances. In many retrospects, Morris was an important milestone in the history of fantasy, because while other writers wrote of foreign lands or of dream worlds or long past periods in our history, the legendary times, Morris's works were the first to be set in entirely invented fantasy worlds. So yeah, unfortunately, Tolkien didn't invent the fantasy world. He did it great, but it was Morris who invented it. Other authors would follow after, guys like Morris, and one of them, you most likely heard of him, Oscar Wilde, wrote both dark fantasy, books like The Picture of Dorian Gray, and a large number of children's fantasies, collected in books like The Happy Prince and Other Stories, which was published in 1888, and an 1891 book called A House of Pomegranates. In 1899, the first part of Edith Nesbit's The Story of the Treasure Seekers was published. This is the first novel of children's books by Nesbit, and it also contained many fantasy elements in it, and her later novels exerted considerable influence on subsequent authors like C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, and J.K. Rowling, the writer of Harry Potter, has ranked Nesbit as one of her favorite authors, and the same book, The Story of the Treasure Seekers, as her favorite Nesbit book. Another prominent author was the writer of The Wizard of Oz. The Wizard of Oz came out in 1900, the year 1900, and it was written by Lyman Frank Baum. I hope I pronounced that right and didn't screw it up. And another prominent author is Edward John Morton Drax Plankton, 18th Baron of Dunstan, also known as Lord Dunstan. That's the name that he penned under. So you don't have to know the whole full name, you just have to know him as Lord Dunstan. Now, Lord Dunstan was born on the 24th of July, 1878, and he also stepped into the fantasy genre. He was an Anglo-Irish writer and dramatist who published over 90 books of his work, which was mainly fantasy. These books include his best known today, which is his 1924 fantasy novel, The King of Elfland's Daughter, and For the Gods of Pegana, in which he devised a fictional pantheon and laid the groundwork for the fantasy genre. The heroic romances of William Morris, set in imaginary lands of the author's creation, greatly affected him. So he was inspired by William Morris. And as you can see, all of these authors have a ripple effect, inspiring others to do other stuff with the genre. And Dunstan himself would go on to inspire authors like Lovecraft, Tolkien, Howard, and Ursula Gwynn, the author of Earthsea. Sorry. Just having a little problem with the throat. And yeah, Dunstan was a huge influence on the genre. His whimsical writing style was so loved and so emulated that Ursula Le Guin literally complained about how it damaged the genre. Not that he meant to it, but you know how it is. You get successful, you have a lot of imitators. Howard had to suffer the same thing. And after Howard, we reached the end of our tale. Not Howard, Dunstan, Lord Dunstan. Don't know why I made that mistake. We reached the end of our tale on the 29th of July in the year 1954, when a not so well-known little book called The Fellowship of the Ring by an author called John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was published. And that was when Tolkien, taking a lot of the great influences of the past, was able to make a formula to fantasy that we still feel to this day. This has been Red Chaos One, and this is the history of fantasy pre-Tolkien.